can you tell us a little bit about how did it all come about? When did you kind of come into the project, and what was the experience of? I presume this is like the first film that you've made. So how was it for you, basically?
Um, well, thanks everyone for being here. This is such a thrill to see this on the big screen in this format. I've seen it on a very small screen, but I feel like a little child. It's really, it's it's the beyond the most feverish dreams of even the most passionate mycophile to have this time-lapse footage so vast and so very happy that Steve and Catherine, who did a lot of that time-lapse footage, are here today from Australia.
Oh wow!
Wow. And that's really why, when the producers approached me and said, would I be interested in working with them on a film about fungi for a big screen, what made me say yes was the fact that Steve and Catherine were involved. And I thought, well, if it's going to be led by their time lapse, then it's going to be something I'm interested in. So it's such a big part of it. The photography, the technique, the skill, the vision, the patience, the craft to get these time-lapse sequences, not just the mushrooms, but the microscopic ones, the mycelial ones. Wim van Egmond and Patrick Hickey are the big players there. And it's just amazing. I spend a lot of time looking at fungal videos of fungi doing their thing, but I've watched these so many times, and it feels like I learned something new. And if you are someone who studies giraffes or rhinos or palm trees, that spending time seeing these organisms doing what they're doing, just watching them, just observing what they do, you learn something. You learn something that you don't always know what it is. You don't even know how to talk about it. But watching these time lapses, I feel that feeling, and I'm really just so delighted that that it could be here and could be made. So it's been a really positive experience making this film. I had to walk around some of the most charismatic forests on the planet with a fun-loving, visionary production team, gazing at mushrooms and trying very, very hard to look like I was having thoughts.
Yeah, I feel like you're describing my Monday to Friday. So you were already aware of the guys' time lapse work before you came into the project. It's very much the mushrooms that are star of the show, aren't they? I mean, it's just unbelievable to watch them, especially on this scale. But it's very much the mushrooms, you and Bjork. So did you get to meet her? Was there, or were you in like separate part of the world and you just recorded your stuff separately? What was that like?
So we recorded online, but we subsequently been spending time and talking about fungi and the living world and all sorts of things. And she's such a remarkable artist and thinks and feels in astonishing ways about life and the way that the living world behaves. It feels like she's tapped into a channel, somehow like a radio frequency that she can hear things that not everyone can hear. So it's been a real joy to work with her, and I think she brings exactly the tone that is required here. One of wonder and inviting curiosity. I just feel very welcome when I hear her speaking and telling the story.
Because her own work is she's been engaging with biological stuff, hasn't she? She's done a couple of albums now, which are kind of exploring the idea of the biological world. And so that's relevant, but also her voice is quite magical. Like the mushrooms are quite magical, aren't they? And the Bjork's kind of pixie sort of thing, a bit like a kind of magic fairy thing going on. Was that all very intentional? Was it kind of?
Well, I always liked the idea. I didn't actually. It was Erin, my wife Erin's idea to get Bjork. To ask Bjork, and it was a very long and serendipitous and twisty, tiny process for that all to happen and come together. But from the moment she suggested it, I thought, yes, absolutely, that's the voice that could really tell this story. And so, yeah, it's a real thrill. Yeah, so the time lapse. So I did not do any of the time lapsing, but Wim did the time lapsing of the underground. Watching the mycelium in the soil, and he has special. This is his special secrets. But he uses clear panels up against sort of big troughs of soil, which allow him to see into the soil. He has to light it in a very certain way. He has to get everyone in the big, basically a big plant pot, to keep them all happy. Is not straightforward. So he's a real master of this, and he sees himself as part. He's Dutch, and he sees himself as part of this big Dutch tradition of microscopy, starting with Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who was the first person to describe microorganisms, and so he actually makes and uses a Leeuwenhoek style, 16th century or 17th century microscopes as well. So he's a real visionary, and but only he could really answer that question. And even if he was here, I'm not sure if he would tell you everything. And as regards to call to action, it's a really good question. Two of my beloved fungal colleagues are here, Toby Kears and Juliana Ferci, and we work together on a number of different related parallel braiding projects, trying to help both protect fungal habitats and the processes that they oversee, and also to try and use fungi to advance protection of other organisms as well. And there's lots of approaches that we're taking. Juliana has had amazing success in Chile over many years, and has had fungi written into legislation at the highest level of government, which means that fungi now have to be assessed when you're doing a development or building. You make an environmental impact assessment, you have to include fungi, because including fungi is important, because what we're blind to, we can ignore or destroy. And so a lot of the work is about describing, is about making this world known, revealing the life, the bustling life in the wild, wet world of the soil. Like just lifting the lid so we know. And when we know, then the question is, well, now what do we do with that information? And there's various things that we're exploring. As for a call to action for everybody here, for passionate and engaged civilians, it's not a straightforward. If you have a growing space or a garden, you can leave dead wood lying around. Try to be less neat outside, and don't use chemicals or pesticides on your plants or your growing area. Not everyone has a growing area. You might bring fungi into your life. You might buy a fungal grow kit and watch them grow in your kitchen. You might incorporate them into your diet more and just enjoy touching them as you cook. You might start fermenting and enjoy the taste of the transformations that they oversee with their wild and inventive metabolisms. You might start taking an interest outside when you're going down the street. You might start thinking about the mushroom growing on that tree and how that's just a small expression of a big network that's running its way through that plant and down into the soil. You might start feeling the soil as a deep ocean, and that you're walking on the surface of an ocean of land, and you might feel that depth exploring and exploding beneath you, and enjoy that vertigo and confusion. But yeah, there's not one thing. There's three things really. One is conservation, one is research, and the other is education. And fungi are largely absent from school curricula, even undergraduate courses. Now, I did an undergraduate course in the plant sciences department, and that was the only place you could study fungi as fungi. You could study fungi in sort of medicine in other departments, but or the biochemistry of yeast in other departments. But fungi, their ecology, how they interact with plants and create soils and so forth. That was in a plants department, and they had, I don't know, 4 lectures over the course of my undergraduate degree in fungi, and so it's a huge problem. So introducing them to school curricula, that is Juliana's here, has been working with the Fungi Foundation, which she founded and leads, and they've been doing amazing work in the US, building out. You have to sort of get it into the right shapes and sizes so it can plug into different levels in the school curricula, so then it can just be included. And they've been working on this for a while now, and with some success. But even if you're at school and it's in your curriculum, you know, it's not always the best way to get kids engaged. When I look at a drawing of a plant cell and learn to label the cell wall and the cell membrane and the nucleus, you know, it doesn't really tell me much about life as a plant. And for that, I have to go outside. I have to have teachers who are going to invite me to see and to feel the living world itself. So I think a big part of it is going to be going outside somehow. You know, it might just be bringing the outside into the classroom, a big pot of soil with a plant in it, you know, something like that. But I think this is a real time for visionary, creative, ingenious, strategic alliance forming about how to advance this, because the time is definitely overdue. Yeah, I haven't seen that particular research. There's a eccentric research group in Bristol, at the University of the West of England, who are doing stuff that they call fungal computing, and I think they've got fungi to grow over circuit boards, and it looks quite dramatic. But I haven't heard about the actual, you know, the specific findings. But one of the ways that you can think about it is that fungi they're solving problems. They've evolved for over 1 billion years to solve problems, the kind of problems that they face on a moment-to-moment basis in the course of living their lives. They're living their lives in an insanely complex environment in the soil, you know, a lot of them in the soil, like a multi-dimensional labyrinth filled with all sorts of other creatures, and such a, you know, we can't even imagine. And they've got to stay in touch with themselves as they remodel their body, and they've got to be able to work out how best to send materials and information around themselves, how to integrate data streams, that they're sensing all sorts of things, and they're doing all this without a brain, without any particular place to do so. So in some way, they are spatial computers. You know, you can think about them as computing information, as processing and operating on information. And so people have got them to this, particularly with their spatial abilities. You can encode some mathematical problems spatially in the form of labyrinths, you know, with a number of branches and possibilities. And a lot of these labyrinths, this kind of problem, are very hard to solve using straightforward computing, because you get what's called a combinatorial explosion. There are so many different options, and it takes a long time to compute out all the options and then work out which is the most efficient. And the fungus can just grow through one of these spatialized problems much more rapidly. Well, you know, in its own way, much more rapidly, and tell you the answer. So that's one way. In research and conservation and activism with my team. Tom Shimizu is here, Toby Kears is here, Juliana Furci is here, all very close and dearly beloved collaborators. And we're working on the scale of the very small, looking at how, looking in mycorrhizal networks in the lab, how information moves through these networks, looking at the flows within these networks in great detail. And then we're also looking with an organization that Toby founded called SPUN, the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks. We're looking at the very large, trying to make maps of the mycorrhizal communities across the planet. And then we're trying to work out how we connect the very, very large with the very, very small, and how we can grow these different programs, different kinds of research program together over time. So it's a really exciting moment for us. And there are lots of doors opening, and there's lots of interest, and there's such an incredible team come together. So it's a thrilling time. Overall, fungi are neglected. Fungi are a kingdom of life that have not had a kingdom's worth of attention. Within the study of fungi, marine and aquatic fungi are even more neglected. But they do live in the ocean, and they do live in freshwater ecosystems. And seaweeds, almost all seaweeds depend on symbiotic relationships with fungi to be able to do what they do and survive in the way that they can survive. There's lots of organic matter. All the dead bodies in the ocean are digested by someone, and some of those someones are fungi. You would find fungi growing in sulfurous sediments, you know, deep below the surface of the ocean, and indeed growing along in coral reefs, and perhaps infecting the shells of crustaceans, you know, crawling along the floor of the sea. But this is a world about which we know even less, but is no doubt vitally important. Seagrasses, for example, we're just about to start a project looking into the fungal associates of seagrasses in seagrass meadows to learn about how they make their life together with fungi, and together with fungi can survive and do all these things they can do. I do think they're cognitive systems in their way. I think the cognition is something that we find at all levels in organizations of life, that it's a really a fundamental part of being alive. Of course, different kinds of cognition might look very different, be differently expressed in different organisms. But something about being alive means that life as an organism means that you are a complex amplifier of experience. And you might be a more complex amplifier of experience or a less complex amplifier of experience, but there's something about that which is just essential to the act and process of living. So are fungi wise? I mean, I think my favorite definition of wisdom is by a theologian called David Bentley Hart, and he says that wisdom is the rediscovery of innocence on the far side of experience. And I love that. And I'm not sure what innocence would look like for a fungus, but I can imagine what experience would look like for a fungus. And they've had a lot of experience. They've been around doing their thing for a very, very long time. They've been key architects of some of the most dramatic transitions in the history of life. They've had ringside seats in some of the most cataclysmic moments. And so I do think of them as old, as ancient life support systems that have seen a lot, that hold a lot of experience in the form of their bodies, their genomes. You know, all our genomes in some sense are libraries of past experience encoded in our inheritance, some of which is in our genomes. And so you can think about that whole long unbroken lineage of fungi, all of those experiences, all the way that that's brought into the present moment by their living and by their expression. And maybe if you feel so inclined, you could call that wisdom. I think I feel so inclined. So many things. Fungi, really. Fungi inspired me. And you know, the more that I feel this, and lots of my fungus nerd friends also feel this, the more you learn about fungi, the more you want to know. And it feels like a kind of helter-skelter of fascination. You know, once you get on the slide, you just keep going and you can't really get off. And I had that feeling, and so many others I know have that feeling. And part of that feeling it led me to want to create a space where I could talk about them. And it felt like they weren't getting enough attention, and that people, you know, they're such vital parts of the living world, but we don't talk about them enough. We don't think about them enough. And I think that's the feeling that really, you know, inspired me to write about them and to make the film. But that feeling only came from fungi themselves. So ultimately, fungi inspired me.
That's all we've got time for. If you enjoyed the film, please do go onto your social media channels and make as much noise as you can. There are more screenings of the film here at the BFI IMAX, and there will be screenings at other IMAX cinemas in the UK and all over the world. Thank you to Merlin Sheldrake.